In the blackness of the jungle, where silence itself seemed to breathe, soldiers whispered of shadows that did not belong to the living. Some said they were hallucinations born of exhaustion and fear, but others swore the dead of Vietnam never truly left the battlefield. They came back from the war carrying medals, scars, and memories that refused to die. But some soldiers carried something else, shadows that followed them home. You're watching War Files Uncovered, where the stories buried in history resurface to reveal the terrifying truths soldiers never dared to speak. If you're ready to step into the jungle of forgotten horrors, stay with us. The story begins not in the daylight of battle, but in the hours when the jungle wrapped itself in silence. Veterans describe how the night in Vietnam was unlike any they had known back home. It wasn't simply the hum of insects or the distant echo of gunfire, it was the feeling that unseen eyes were watching. In letters scrawled under red flashlight beams, men confessed they had begun to sense something lurking between the trees, a presence that moved when they moved, that froze when they froze, as though the very air of the jungle held its breath. One such account came from Private William Corbett, who in 1967 found himself on a night watch near Da Nang. The fog was thick, the air wet with the smell of rotting foliage, and every sound felt amplified. Corbett would later admit he thought he was losing his mind when he began hearing footsteps pacing behind him, though no one had been assigned to patrol his sector. He raised his rifle, called out into the darkness, and heard the sound stop immediately, as if something had been standing just feet away. The jungle went still, unnaturally still, until, with a faint rustle, the sound began again, this time circling him. "I thought it was Charlie," he confessed years later, his voice cracking on an old tape recording, "but what I saw in the trees, it wasn't human." The enemy in Vietnam was relentless, but what unnerved these men was that the enemy they felt creeping close was invisible, silent, and cold. Some swore they could smell gunpowder when none had been fired. Others claimed to hear voices, American voices, calling their names from the dark, the voices of men who had been killed in firefights days earlier. Time after time, patrols reported breaking formation because they believed they were following the sound of their sergeant's orders, only to realize their sergeant was beside them, silent and staring pale-faced into the shadows. At 3:42 a.m. on one such night, a Marine unit stationed near Hue described hearing what they thought was a wounded comrade crying out from the trees. Against orders, 2 men broke from their foxholes and crept toward the sound, whispering reassurances into the dark. When they found nothing, they returned shaken, but the cries continued, circling the perimeter, louder and more desperate, until the entire squad had their weapons aimed into the black. At dawn, the sound finally faded, but in the daylight, they discovered something chilling: fresh footprints in the mud leading away from the camp. Bare footprints, small like a child's. For years, these stories were dismissed as battle fatigue, the mind breaking under the weight of fear. But the strange thing is how many of them are the same. Veterans from different platoons, different regions, even different years of the war told stories that mirrored each other. They all spoke of the sensation of being followed, of hearing voices of the dead, of seeing figures that seemed to shimmer and vanish when approached. Some even swore they recognized the faces of friends lost in firefights whose bodies had been recovered and buried. Corbett was not the only one haunted. Sergeant Harold Benton wrote in his journal about a night in 1969 when he saw a figure step into the light of his cigarette. A fellow soldier, Corporal Jenkins, who had been killed by mortar fire weeks before. Benton swore Jenkins looked straight at him, lifted a finger to his lips as if to silence him, and then dissolved into the night mist. Benton never spoke of it aloud until decades later, when he confided to his grandson, "The jungle was full of the dead, and they were restless." As the war dragged on, whispers spread through the ranks that the land itself was cursed. Vietnam, after all, had seen centuries of bloodshed before American boots touched its soil. Local villagers, when asked, told soldiers of spirits that roamed the forests, angry and unappeased, feeding on the endless cycle of death. For soldiers raised in small towns and cities across the United States, the thought was almost unthinkable. Yet under the crushing heat, the endless fear, and the constant closeness of death, many began to believe it. And when the gunfire stopped, when silence finally reclaimed the jungle, those beliefs turned into nightmares that followed them home. One veteran recalled waking in his living room in 1978, sweating, convinced he'd heard the same disembodied cries that had lured men into the jungle years before. Another swore he saw shadows moving across his walls at night, shapes carrying rifles, whispering in languages he didn't understand. Therapists called it trauma. Priests called it haunting. The men themselves were never sure. But what if these were more than memories? What if the jungles of Vietnam held something far older than the war, something the soldiers of both sides had stumbled into without understanding. As these stories multiplied, so did the chilling possibility that the Vietnam War left behind not only survivors in graves, but ghosts still marching through the mist. And this, as veterans would confess in hushed voices decades later, was the war they could never leave behind. The jungles of Vietnam were unlike any battlefield the young Americans had ever seen. In World War II, the enemy often wore a uniform. The front line could be drawn on a map, and victories were measured in territory gained. But here, in the sweltering green abyss, there was no line, no safety, no certainty. One moment a soldier was crouched in silence, listening to cicadas. The next, a sniper's shot cracked through the air, or a mine erupted beneath their boots. It was this constant state of not knowing, of being hunted by both the living and perhaps the dead, that warped reality. Soldiers often spoke about the oppressive weight of the jungle. By day, the heat pressed against their skin like an iron, sweat dripping into their eyes, the dense foliage hiding everything but the immediate few feet ahead. By night, however, the jungle transformed into something far more terrifying. The moonlight barely filtered through the canopy, creating endless layers of shadow where anything, or anyone, could hide. The night had teeth, one veteran muttered years later in a VA hospital, his hands trembling as though even decades of distance could not dim the memory. It was in this darkness that the stories of ghosts became impossible to ignore. In the Central Highlands, near Pleiku, a platoon was assigned to a ridge patrol after reports of Viet Cong movement. The night was quiet, almost unnervingly so. The men spread out, rifles at the ready, nerves stretched thin. Then just after midnight, the man at point raised his hand sharply. He heard voices. The men froze. The voices grew louder. American voices, laughing, even singing fragments of a country song that had been popular back home. Confused but relieved, they thought another unit was nearby. But when they followed the sound, the laughter twisted into screams, and then abruptly stopped. The forest fell into silence again. When they reported it back to base, they were told no American units had been operating within miles of their position. One of those soldiers, Tom Gallagher, later admitted on tape, "I thought I'd lost it. Thought I'd cracked." But then the other guys swore they'd heard it too. Same song, same laughter. And the way it cut off, it wasn't normal. It was like someone flipped a switch. Gallagher would go on to suffer recurring nightmares, waking drenched in sweat. The echo of those screams lodged in his ears long after the war had ended. There were also the lights, strange floating lights that appeared without warning. In 1968, during the Tet Offensive, a squad huddled in the ruins of a bombed-out village outside Hue. Amid the smoldering timbers and shattered clay walls, they claimed to have seen glowing orbs weaving through the rubble, moving with intent as if searching. At first, the men assumed they were flares, but the lights hovered silently, glowing blue-white, unaffected by the wind, and then sank into the ground, vanishing. One soldier tried to chase after them, only to collapse when the light passed directly through his body, leaving him cold, shaken, and whispering that he felt emptier than before. He refused to speak about it again. Perhaps the most unsettling stories, however, were not of things seen or heard, but of things felt. Veterans described sudden drops in temperature, as if a cold hand had brushed their skin in the midst of tropical heat. They reported an unshakable sense of being watched, of a weight pressing down on their chest when they tried to sleep, of invisible fingers tugging at their gear. Some recalled the smell, pungent, acrid like burned flesh, that appeared and disappeared without warning, often right before firefights broke out. Superstition began to spread quietly through the ranks. If you smelled burning flesh where there was no fire, someone was about to die. Back home, these men struggled to explain it. Doctors called it post-traumatic stress, hallucinations born of sleep deprivation and terror. But among the veterans themselves, in late-night conversations at reunions or whispered phone calls across states, they admitted they weren't so sure. Too many men had seen the same things, felt the same cold, heard the same voices of dead comrades calling them deeper into the trees. Private First Class Daniel Harker told a story that still gives his family chills. One night, deep in the Mekong Delta, his squad set up camp in a clearing after an exhausting day of patrol. Exhaustion pulled them into restless sleep, but Harker awoke suddenly to the sound of someone sobbing just outside the perimeter. Crawling to his feet, he peered into the darkness and saw a figure kneeling on the ground, clutching its stomach as though wounded. He called out softly, fearing it was a villager caught in the crossfire. The figure slowly raised its head, and Harker's blood ran cold. It was his best friend, Jimmy Tate, who had died in an ambush 3 weeks earlier. Before he could react, the figure vanished, leaving nothing but trampled grass. Harker swore the air smelled of gunpowder and blood for hours afterward. Some men turned to religion for answers, carrying crosses, rosaries, or small Bibles tucked in their breast pockets. Others dismissed it all as madness. But even the skeptics admitted there were nights when the jungle seemed alive, not with animals or enemies, but with something far older, something that did not belong in the realm of the living. Locals told them stories of restless spirits, wandering souls of the unburied, forever seeking release. The Americans, unaccustomed to such beliefs, found themselves absorbing them all the same. And the war itself seemed to feed the legend. Villages reduced to ash, bodies left unclaimed in the mud, rivers stained with blood. All of it created a landscape heavy with sorrow. Soldiers whispered that Vietnam was not just a battlefield, it was a graveyard that stretched for miles, every tree root entwined with bones, every gust of wind carrying the cries of the lost. The veterans who returned carried those cries with them. For some, it was the nightmares, waking at 2:17 a.m. to the sound of boots marching through their hallways. For others, it was the shadows, shapes flickering across their bedrooms when no one else was home. One veteran years after the war swore he saw a mud-covered handprint appear on his bathroom mirror, dripping wet though the glass was dry moments earlier. Another reported that every time he tried to fall asleep, he would hear his name whispered in a voice that sounded like his fallen commander. These were not isolated accounts. Across the country, men who had never met told eerily similar stories. Some found comfort in sharing them. Others refused to speak, fearing they would be dismissed as insane. But privately, they all knew the truth. The ghosts of Vietnam had followed them home. And the question remained, were these the scars of trauma, or was there something truly haunting the men who fought in a land soaked in centuries of blood? The veterans didn't know. All they knew was this: the war had ended, but the shadows had not. The war in Vietnam created a rhythm of silence and sudden chaos that etched itself into the minds of the men who survived it. Days of endless waiting would be shattered by minutes of unimaginable violence, and when the smoke cleared, the silence returned, heavier than before. It was within that silence that the haunting seemed to creep the strongest. Veterans often described it as though the jungle itself was aware of them, as if the trees had eyes, the rivers had voices, and the shadows harbored memories of those who had bled into the soil. Corporal Eddie Ramirez recounted a moment in 1966 when his squad stumbled across an abandoned French outpost, a crumbling relic left from the war that had bled this land only a decade earlier. The place was silent except for the distant hum of insects, the concrete walls cracked and swallowed by vines. But inside, the men claimed to hear footsteps echoing in the empty halls, boots on stone, pacing endlessly. They searched room to room, rifles raised, but found nothing. Ramirez said it wasn't until nightfall that the true horror began. The sound of voices, speaking in French, then screaming, then begging in a language none of them fully understood. They abandoned the outpost before dawn, shaken, each man swearing he'd heard something different. Some said they heard gunfire, others weeping, others prayers whispered in desperation. Yet none of it could be explained. Stories like Ramirez's spread quickly among the ranks, though always in hushed tones, told in foxholes or whispered over cans of rations. No one wanted to admit they believed in ghosts, yet no one could dismiss what they had seen. Sergeant Lewis Parker, stationed near Khe Sanh, told of a patrol where every man swore they saw a figure walking ahead of them in the moonlight. The figure was in uniform, helmet and rifle in hand, moving with the same weary stride as any soldier. They thought it was one of their own until the figure stepped into a clearing and simply vanished. The grass where he had walked was undisturbed, the soil untouched. Parker said one of his men dropped to his knees, shaking uncontrollably, repeating the Lord's Prayer as though it were the only thing anchoring him to sanity. The Vietnamese themselves seemed almost unsurprised by these encounters. Local villagers told tales of Ma, restless spirits doomed to wander. They spoke of men who died violently without proper burial, whose souls lingered where they had fallen. To the villagers, the jungle was alive with these spirits, and the Americans, arrogant, young, and dismissive of old beliefs, were walking straight into their world. Interpreters sometimes warned the soldiers not to disturb certain groves of trees, not to camp near particular rivers, not to touch offerings left on the side of the road. Few listened, but those who did often found the warnings chillingly accurate. One Marine recounted how, in 1969, his unit ignored such a warning and camped near a riverbank dotted with small shrines. That night, every man in the camp woke to the sound of children laughing. The laughter circled them, weaving through the darkness, impossible to pinpoint. Some swore they felt small hands tugging at their boots. When morning came, they found the shrines overturned, offerings scattered, the river running strangely still. The Marines left quickly and none spoke of it again until years later. Back in the United States, the haunting continued. For some, it was through dreams so vivid they blurred the line between memory and nightmare. Sergeant Benton, the man who had once seen the apparition of Corporal Jenkins, described waking at precisely 3 a.m. every night for months, drenched in sweat, certain he had just heard footsteps circling his bed. For others, it was through the house itself. A veteran from Ohio swore that every time he entered his basement, he smelled the jungle, damp earth, smoke, and rotting foliage, as though the war had seeped into his very walls. Perhaps the most unsettling were the apparitions that followed them. In Wisconsin, a man named Harold Denton claimed he often saw his old squad mate standing in his yard at night, helmet under his arm, face blank, watching. Denton had been there the day that squad mate was killed, torn apart by mortar fire, and knew with certainty he could not be alive. Yet the figure appeared again and again, always in silence, always at a distance, until one night it simply never returned. Denton never told his wife, but in interviews decades later he whispered, "I wasn't afraid of him. I was afraid of what it meant, that the dead knew where I lived." As the years passed, more veterans began to open up about their experiences. Support groups, once places to talk about firefights and ambushes, became spaces where men admitted to seeing things they couldn't explain. Some broke down in tears confessing that they still heard their fallen brothers calling their names. Others admitted they never truly left Vietnam because the war had followed them home in ways no one else could see. Psychologists continued to write it off as PTSD, the brain's attempt to make sense of trauma. But what of the footprints in the mud? The lights in the ruins? The voices recorded faintly on radios even when no one spoke? These details lingered like unanswered questions, gnawing at the edges of explanation. One chilling case surfaced in 1975, just weeks after the fall of Saigon. A group of Marines who had served together gathered for a reunion. As they swapped stories, one man, a radio operator, revealed he still had tapes from the field, recordings of communications, static, and chatter meant for intelligence review. He played one tape for the group. At first, it was nothing unusual, static, coded exchanges, then silence. But after the silence came a faint voice. Not one but several. Whispers. Some in English, some in Vietnamese, layered over one another, repeating the names of the men in the room. Each name clear and deliberate. The tape hissed, then cut off. The room fell silent. No one laughed. No one spoke. The tape was destroyed that night. And yet the stories persisted, multiplying, evolving, as though the ghosts themselves demanded to be remembered. Veterans who had buried their tales for decades found themselves breaking down at funerals, unable to keep the shadows inside. Widows spoke of their husbands waking at night, screaming names of men long dead, swearing the bedroom was filled with figures standing in the corners. Children grew up in homes where their fathers refused to enter certain rooms after dark, claiming they weren't alone. The ghosts of Vietnam were not confined to the jungle. They had crossed oceans, boarded planes, slipped silently into the hearts and minds of those who survived. And they would not let go. The war had ended. But for these men, the haunting had only just begun. The war had not just scarred bodies and landscapes, it had fractured reality itself for many of the men who lived through it. By the late 1960s, whispers of the unexplained were spreading like an invisible current through the ranks. Some soldiers dismissed them as campfire tales meant to pass the long nights, but others felt there was a deeper truth, a pattern emerging from countless stories that could not be ignored. The jungle was not just a battlefield, it was a graveyard, and the dead were restless. Private First Class Robert Hastings remembered the night it began for him. It was January 14, 1968, the air thick with smoke from burning villages after a day of brutal combat. Hastings was on watch, perched above a trench, when he noticed a figure moving in the tree line. At first, he thought it was a villager who had strayed too close, but as the figure stepped forward, he recognized the uniform, an American one, tattered, stained with mud. The soldier raised his hand in greeting, his face obscured in shadow. Hastings lifted his rifle, shouted for identification, but the figure remained silent. Then, in a flash of moonlight, Hastings saw the face. It was his squad leader, Lieutenant Carver, who had died that morning from a bullet wound to the chest. Before Hastings could react, the figure faded into mist. When he later told his comrades, not a single man doubted him. They had all heard footsteps in the night, footsteps that belonged to no living man. These weren't isolated encounters. In Quang Tri Province, a group of Marines reported hearing drums in the distance long after midnight. At first, they assumed it was enemy movement or villagers performing a ritual. But the rhythm was strange, slow, steady, almost funereal. The men described it as though the earth itself was beating a pulse, echoing in their chests. When they investigated at dawn, they found nothing but burned stumps and abandoned rice paddies. No villagers had lived there in months. The sound of the drums never returned, but the men swore that for the rest of their deployment, every firefight began with that same rhythm pounding in their ears. One of the most chilling accounts came from Sergeant Alan "Red" McCarthy, a man known among his unit for his skepticism and iron resolve. McCarthy openly mocked the ghost stories, insisting that exhaustion and jungle fever were to blame. But in May of 1969, during a night patrol near the Cambodian border, even McCarthy faltered. His unit set up an ambush along a narrow trail, lying in wait as hours passed in silence. Then, without warning, a man's voice boomed from the darkness, clear, commanding, in perfect English. It was the voice of their captain calling out orders, telling them to reposition. Confused, the men scrambled, obeying the commands. But McCarthy froze, paralyzed, because he knew the captain had been killed by sniper fire 2 days earlier. The voice faded into the jungle, leaving them shaken and exposed. McCarthy never mocked the stories again. Radio operators, too, carried their share of unexplained horrors. Static-filled frequencies often picked up voices that should not have been there. Operators reported hearing names spoken softly, like whispers carried on the wind. Some swore they heard distress calls from men already confirmed dead, calling coordinates or begging for extraction. In one terrifying incident, a transmission came through with a soldier's screams, followed by the unmistakable crackle of gunfire. The men listening rushed to respond, only to find out that the call was identical, word for word, to a recording made 3 weeks earlier, when that very soldier had been killed in action. The Vietnamese countryside itself seemed to conspire in these hauntings. In villages bombed to rubble, soldiers described wandering into homes where the air felt colder, heavier. Some swore they heard faint lullabies, mothers singing to children long gone. Others claimed to see lanterns swaying in the ruins, though no fire burned within them. Even hardened officers admitted unease in these places, avoiding them when possible, as if the ground itself resisted occupation. Yet the most terrifying experiences were often personal, intimate encounters that left men doubting their own sanity. Corporal James Holloway told of a night when he awoke to find a man sitting at the foot of his cot. The figure's face was pale, his uniform soaked in blood. Holloway blinked, thinking it a dream, but the figure leaned forward and whispered, "Don't forget me." Then it was gone. Holloway later admitted the figure was his cousin, drafted months after him, who had been killed in a separate battle. Holloway had not even known of his cousin's death until weeks later, when news finally reached him. The jungles of Vietnam were filled with such encounters, each one chipping away at the certainty of what was real and what was imagined. Some soldiers turned to alcohol and drugs, desperate to silence the visions. Others embraced ritual, creating makeshift shrines in their camps, leaving offerings of cigarettes, food, or trinkets in hopes of appeasing whatever spirits lingered. There were even reports of men refusing to fire on villages at night, claiming they had seen spectral women standing in doorways, their eyes glowing faintly, watching. For those who returned home, the hauntings did not remain behind in the jungle. Instead, they seeped into quiet suburban homes, into dimly lit apartments, into the restless sleep of men trying to rebuild their lives. Veterans spoke of seeing their old squad mates in mirrors, of hearing jungle sounds in the middle of cities, of waking to find mud and water on their bedroom floors as though the swamps themselves had followed them back. Perhaps most disturbing were the accounts of family members. Wives and children often noticed the hauntings before the veterans themselves admitted them. Some described the sudden smell of rotting foliage in their homes. Others claimed to see shadowy figures standing at the edges of hallways, figures in uniforms from a war they had never fought. Children would wake screaming in the night, insisting that soldiers were watching them from the corners of their rooms. What made these stories so powerful was not just their detail, but their consistency. Different men from different units, across different years of the conflict, all described eerily similar experiences. Apparitions of dead comrades, voices on the wind, footsteps circling camps, lights that moved with intent. The line between psychological trauma and supernatural presence blurred, leaving veterans caught in a liminal space where neither explanation felt complete. By the early 1970s, whispers spread among support groups that Vietnam was unlike any other war in history. Not just because of the politics or the jungle or the endless stalemate, but because of the way it clung to those who survived it. Men who had fought in Korea or Europe admitted they had nightmares, but few spoke of ghosts. In Vietnam, the ghosts were unavoidable. They were part of the war itself. And as veterans aged, their stories only grew darker. Some swore the hauntings grew stronger with time, as if the spirits were impatient, unwilling to be forgotten. Others wondered if the dead of Vietnam had not simply haunted them, but chosen them, as carriers, as witnesses, as unwilling storytellers for a war that refused to die. The question remained, whispered in support circles, whispered in hospital wards, whispered in lonely kitchens late at night. Were these men haunted by their minds or by the war itself? And if the war itself was alive, could it ever truly end? For some veterans, the hauntings were less about apparitions and more about time itself becoming unsteady, fractured, refusing to move forward. Staff Sergeant Martin Doyle remembered one night in 1970 when his patrol stopped to rest along a muddy riverbank. Exhaustion weighed on them like chains. Men slumped against trees, eyes closing, rifles across their laps. Doyle stayed awake, listening to the drip of water and the croak of unseen frogs. Then he noticed something strange. The jungle had gone silent. The frogs stopped. The insects stopped. Even the river's flow seemed muffled, like sound itself had been swallowed. In the stillness, Doyle swore he could hear faint music, a scratchy old record, the kind his father used to play back in Boston. He blinked in confusion, certain he was hallucinating. But one by one, his men stirred awake, whispering the same thing, music, tinny and distant, threading through the trees. The song was familiar, but none of them could name it. When they tried to track the sound, it slipped away like smoke. Years later, Doyle said, "That was the moment I knew the jungle wasn't just jungle. It was something else. Something alive." Time itself seemed to warp in other stories as well. Corporal Andrew Moore described entering a village reduced to rubble, black smoke still curling into the sky. The destruction was total. Roofs collapsed, walls caved in, fields scorched. Yet in the middle of the devastation, he saw a woman kneeling calmly beside a well, drawing water. Her clothes were spotless, her movements serene. When he blinked, she was gone. The well was cracked, empty, its rope burned away. Moore never forgot the look on her face, peaceful, almost defiant, as if daring him to question whether she had been real. Radio operators, too, were plagued with impossible transmissions. One Marine, Joseph Linderman, claimed his radio came alive one night with a garbled transmission. Through the static, he heard a voice screaming coordinates. Coordinates he recognized immediately as the location of his own squad. He responded, demanding identification, but the only reply was heavy breathing, followed by the sound of gunfire. Moments later, his squad was ambushed. Linderman swore to his dying day that the transmission had been a warning, a ghostly echo trying to save them. But others who heard it believed it was the opposite. A lure, a trap set not by the Viet Cong but by something older, something that fed on death. And then there were the dreams. Veterans often said Vietnam followed them most viciously when their eyes were closed. Nightmares were expected, but these were different. They weren't just memories replayed, they were intrusions, scenes that had never happened yet felt as real as any firefight. Men dreamed of walking through villages filled with faceless people, of being led through jungles by shadowy guides who whispered in languages they didn't understand. Some dreamed of their own deaths, watching themselves fall under gunfire, only to wake up screaming, clawing at the air. One veteran, Richard "Bucky" Haynes, claimed he dreamed of standing in a rice paddy surrounded by his entire squad, every man staring at him with hollow eyes. The nightmare was so vivid that he refused to sleep indoors for weeks, camping outside his own home as though fresh air could drive the shadows away. What haunted many most deeply was the sense of unfinished business. The war had claimed countless lives, often leaving bodies unrecovered, unburied, forgotten in swamps and fields. Soldiers spoke of guilt, of leaving comrades behind, of watching helicopters lift off while wounded men screamed below. That guilt became fertile soil for hauntings. Men swore they heard those voices again years later. Sometimes in their homes, sometimes in the wind outside their windows, sometimes in the faint hum of traffic. One veteran described hearing his friend's dying cry, "Don't leave me," every time he started his car engine. Another said he saw mud-stained boots at the foot of his bed each morning, boots that left no prints when he touched the floor. Families felt it too. Wives recalled their husbands waking in the middle of the night, staring into the darkness, whispering conversations as if someone else were in the room. Children spoke of invisible playmates, soldiers, who told them stories or taught them songs they could not have known. In one particularly unsettling case, a veteran's daughter woke screaming one night, claiming a man with no face had been standing by her window. When the father rushed to comfort her, he froze. He had seen that same faceless figure in his dreams for years. Priests were called. Therapists were called. Exorcists were even called in some cases. The answers varied, Demons, trauma, restless souls, but the result was always the same. The veterans remained haunted. Some turned to alcohol to dull the edges, others to isolation, locking themselves away from the world. Yet the shadows persisted, clinging, reminding them that the war had not ended when they came home. What gave these accounts their chilling power was not just their terror but their persistence. Decades later, men in their 70s still whispered about the footsteps, the voices, the lights in the trees. Some wept when telling their stories, not because of fear but because they no longer trusted their own memories. Were they going mad, or had they glimpsed a world beyond death? And then there were the tapes. Scattered across the years, veterans uncovered old reel-to-reel recordings from the war, radio chatter, field notes, fragments of music played on cheap recorders to drown out the noise of gunfire. Again and again, the tapes revealed things no one could explain. Whispered names, unintelligible chanting, sounds of footsteps when no one was present. One tape recovered from a bunker near Chu Lai was played decades later by a collector. At first, it seemed like nothing more than static. But as the hiss deepened, a voice emerged. "We are still here." The jungle had swallowed lives, consumed bodies, and hidden graves. But it seemed unwilling to release the souls. And as the veterans aged, as their numbers dwindled, one question grew heavier than all the rest. Had they left Vietnam, or had Vietnam never left them? By the early 1970s, the Vietnam War had left scars that no surgeon could repair. America counted its losses in coffins and body bags, but for the men who returned, the true cost of the war was measured in the silence of their nights. They carried with them not just memories of gunfire and blood, but something heavier, something unseen, something that whispered in the dark and refused to let them forget. Lieutenant David Connors, a man known for his steel nerves, came home in 1971 and found himself unable to sleep. His wife, Margaret, would later recall waking to find him standing at the window, staring into the night. When she asked what he saw, his answer never changed: the jungle. Connors swore he could still hear it, the crackle of distant gunfire, the rustle of unseen movement, the faint cries of men calling his name. One night, at exactly 2:17 a.m., Margaret found him crouched in the hallway, rifle in hand, whispering orders to soldiers who weren't there. His eyes were wide, unblinking, locked on figures only he could see. Veterans like Connors described their homes becoming extensions of the battlefield. In basements and attics, they swore they heard boots pacing. In kitchens, they smelled burning gunpowder. Some claimed their radios and televisions flickered with voices that spoke in Vietnamese, even when unplugged. One man, Thomas Jenkins, swore he awoke to the sound of his living room television blaring static. When he stumbled in, the screen glowed white, and within the static he saw faces of the men in his unit, their eyes hollow, their mouths opening and closing as if speaking words he could not hear. The television shut off on its own, plunging the room into darkness. Jenkins never turned it on again. For many, the hauntings blurred with guilt. Survivors' guilt was already a crushing burden, but the apparitions made it unbearable. Men confessed to seeing the faces of comrades they had left behind, appearing at the edge of their vision in mirrors, in reflections on windows, even in the shimmer of water in sinks. One soldier, Jack Crawford, admitted he couldn't shave for years because every time he leaned over his bathroom mirror, he saw his friend Mason, dead from a grenade blast, standing behind him, watching silently. Crawford grew a thick beard not as a fashion, but as a shield against the ghosts. There were patterns too, as though the dead had chosen times to remind the living of their presence. Many veterans reported being woken between 3 o'clock and 4 a.m., the so-called hour of silence, when the world seemed unnaturally still. Some said they heard knocking on their doors or windows at precisely the same time each night, though no one was ever outside. Others claimed objects moved on their own, helmets sliding from shelves, medals falling from walls, dog tags swaying without a breeze. One of the most unsettling stories came from a reunion in 1985, when a group of Marines gathered at a lodge in Colorado. As they drank and reminisced, they began to share the darker stories, the ghosts, the voices, the nightmares. Around midnight, the power flickered and the room went cold. The men laughed nervously until the lodge's old radio crackled to life. Through the static came a faint, familiar sound. Their own voices, recorded decades earlier, calling out positions during a firefight. The recording played for 2 full minutes before cutting off with a scream no one recognized. The room fell silent. None of the men spoke for the rest of the night. Priests and ministers became quiet confidants for many veterans. Father Michael O'Rourke, who served as a chaplain in Saigon, later confessed that countless men had approached him with the same chilling confessions, that they were being followed by the dead. He described one man who came to him in 1972 weeping, swearing that every night he saw a line of soldiers marching past his bedroom, their uniforms torn, their faces pale. "They don't look at me," the man sobbed. "They don't even see me. They're just marching like they're still on patrol. But I know every face. Every one of them died in front of me." The chaplain prayed with him, blessed his home, even performed a quiet exorcism. But when O'Rourke checked on the man months later, he was gone, dead by his own hand. In his journal, O'Rourke wrote, "The ghosts of Vietnam are stronger than the prayers of the living." Meanwhile, stories spread beyond the veterans themselves. Families, friends, even strangers reported strange occurrences when in the company of those who had served. A nurse at a VA hospital recalled tending to an elderly veteran who screamed suddenly in the night. When she rushed to his room, she found him cowering in the corner, pointing to the empty bed. "They're here," he whispered. "All of them. They've come to take me back." The nurse swore the room felt freezing, her breath visible in the air, though the hallway outside remained warm. The man died hours later, his eyes still wide, fixed on something no one else could see. What made these stories impossible to dismiss was their sheer consistency. Men across the country, from different units, different battles, different decades, told the same tales. Footsteps in the night, voices calling their names, faces of the dead appearing in mirrors. These weren't just soldiers with trauma. These were men haunted in ways that defied explanation. And then came the photographs. Veterans digging through old shoeboxes, flipping through faded Polaroids, sometimes found images that shouldn't have been there. A man posing with his squad in front of a helicopter would later notice, years down the line, a figure in the background no one remembered being there. Pale, blurred, watching. In another photo, taken at a base camp near Da Nang, a faint handprint appeared on the shoulder of a soldier who had died only hours later. The negatives showed no defects. The images were real. By the end of the decade, whispers turned to conviction. The war had not just killed men. It had trapped them. Somewhere between life and death, the jungles of Vietnam held on to its ghosts, and those who had survived were cursed to carry them forever. And so the question deepened, not whether the veterans were haunted, but whether the war itself had become a haunting, stretching across oceans and decades, refusing to end. The strangest part of these stories was how the hauntings seemed to grow stronger as the years passed, as though the distance of time did not weaken the grip of Vietnam, but tightened it. Veterans who had spoken of little more than nightmares in the 70s were, by the 90s, describing full encounters. Objects moving, figures standing at the foot of their beds, voices whispering in their ears as they drifted towards sleep. Some claimed the presence grew sharper as anniversaries approached. Battle dates, death dates, even birthdays of the fallen. It was as if the ghosts kept calendars of their own, waiting for the perfect moment to return. One such case was Sergeant Harold Watkins. He had survived the Tet Offensive, only to live the rest of his life in dread of January 30th. On that date every year, no matter where he was, Watkins reported hearing the same sound. The thunder of mortars, the echo of screams, the frantic calls of men pinned down. His wife described how, without fail, Watkins would be shaken from his sleep at 3:42 a.m., the exact time his unit had been ambushed in 1968. On one anniversary in 1988, she swore she awoke to find her husband standing rigid at the window, saluting. She looked outside and saw, in the faint snowlight, a line of shadowy figures marching silently past their yard. By the time she blinked, the figures were gone. Watkins never spoke of what he saw, but every year after, he kept vigil, sitting in the dark, waiting for the march to pass. Others experienced hauntings not in their homes, but in public places. At airports, veterans reported hearing phantom footsteps keeping pace behind them. In grocery stores, some claimed to catch sight of comrades reflected in freezer glass, only to turn and find no one there. In one chilling incident, a Vietnam veteran riding the subway in New York felt a hand rest firmly on his shoulder. Startled, he turned, expecting to see another passenger. Instead, the car behind him was empty. But on the glass, a muddy handprint remained, smearing downward before fading into nothing. Some hauntings carried an almost unbearable intimacy. Robert McNeil, a former medic, described waking one night to the sensation of someone clutching his wrist. He sat up in terror and saw a man kneeling beside his bed, his chest torn open, his lips trembling as he tried to speak. McNeil recognized him instantly, a soldier he had failed to save in 1969. The apparition held on for a long, silent moment before dissolving into the air, leaving McNeil shaking and gasping. For the rest of his life, he wore long sleeves to bed, unable to forget the icy grip around his arm. The idea that Vietnam had followed these men into their lives was terrifying enough, but some veterans believed the dead had followed them into their deaths. Caregivers at VA hospitals whispered of entire wards growing cold when certain veterans passed away. Monitors flickered. Lights dimmed. Nurses reported hearing whispered conversations in the hallways, though no one was there. On more than one occasion, patients gasped awake in their final moments, staring in horror at something no one else could see. "They've come for me," one veteran whispered before flatlining. Another man, moments before his death, cried out in Vietnamese, a language he had never spoken in life. And then there were the photographs from the war that surfaced decades later, sometimes found in trunks, sometimes sold at estate auctions, sometimes left in forgotten footlockers. Collectors noticed patterns, shadows in the backgrounds, blurred faces where none should be, streaks of light cutting across soldiers as if the jungle itself were trying to swallow them whole. In one photo, a Marine crouched beside a sandbag wall. Behind him, half hidden, was the pale face of a man with hollow eyes. The negative confirmed the figure was there, yet no one from his unit recognized the face. Some veterans went further still, claiming they were not merely haunted, but hunted. They described being chased in dreams through endless jungles, hearing footsteps always a step behind. Some said they woke with scratches across their backs and arms, as if they had truly been running through brambles. One man reported mud caked across his bedroom floor, despite living in a third-story apartment. His landlord swore no one had entered. For those who tried to find peace through therapy, the sessions often uncovered more than trauma. Psychologists wrote of patients who spoke in voices not their own, who described events they could not possibly have witnessed, who stared past their doctors as though seeing someone else in the room. One doctor recalled a session with a Marine who suddenly froze mid-sentence, his eyes rolling back, his lips whispering in Vietnamese. When he came to, he wept uncontrollably, swearing he had seen the faces of every man who had died under his command. The hauntings spread like a web, linking the living to the dead and the dead to each other. In veteran reunions across the country, men compared notes, realizing they had seen the same figures, heard the same cries, dreamed the same dreams. Some began to believe the ghosts weren't merely personal, they were collective, bound to all who had walked the jungles. They spoke of Vietnam as a place that did not end with borders or oceans, a place that had followed them home and planted itself in their lives like a curse. And always, beneath the stories, was the same question, whispered in fear but never answered. What if the ghosts were not just memories, not just echoes, but the dead themselves, still marching, still fighting, still searching for rest in a war that had never ended? The veterans carried that question into their old age, into hospitals, into graves of their own. And in the stillness of the night, when the air was cold and the world was quiet, some swore they heard the answer. Footsteps in the hall, voices calling their names, the jungle alive again in the darkness. There were places in Vietnam where soldiers swore the earth itself was cursed, where every patrol ended in blood, where no man who entered left unchanged. These were not villages or bases, not even enemy strongholds, but stretches of jungle that seemed older than time, places where silence hung heavy and the air felt charged with unseen eyes. The men gave these places names whispered only in camp. Dead Man's Creek, the Weeping Hill, the Forest of Teeth. On the maps they were nothing, just swaths of green and river, but in the memory of those who fought there, they were gateways to something darker. One such place was a stretch of swamp outside Quang Tri. Soldiers moving through it at night reported hearing voices bubbling up from the mud itself, as though the earth was alive with the cries of the drowned. Men sank waist deep in muck that seemed to grip them like hands, refusing to let go. Corporal David Ruiz described pulling one of his squad mates from the swamp, only to find claw marks on the man's ankles, deep gouges as though something beneath had tried to drag him under. The swamp smelled of rot and gunpowder, though no battle had been fought there in weeks. Years later, when veterans returned as tourists, locals refused to guide them into that swamp. Too many dead, one farmer said simply. The ground remembers. Even mountains were not free of the curse. At Hamburger Hill, where the battle had claimed hundreds of lives, soldiers returning after the fight reported hearing screams carried on the wind. Some swore they saw figures climbing the slopes at night, stumbling upward only to vanish into the mist. Decades later, hikers reported the same thing, shadows moving across ridges when no one else was near, the echo of gunfire that faded into silence as quickly as it came. For the veterans who had fought there, the hill was not just a battlefield, it was a wound that never closed. But perhaps the most infamous of these cursed sites was an abandoned French outpost deep in the jungle. Long before American boots touched the ground, the French had fought and bled there, leaving behind rusted helmets, collapsed bunkers, and, according to rumor, an entire company of men who vanished without explanation. American patrols passing through the ruins spoke of cold winds cutting through the heat, of hearing French voices carried through the trees, of shadows moving along crumbling walls. One Marine swore he found a bunker door chained shut, the words "Ne pas ouvrir," "do not open," scratched into the wood. When he returned days later, the door had been ripped open from the inside. The jungle itself seemed to feed on fear. Men reported that trees bent unnaturally, that roots twisted into shapes resembling faces, that vines coiled like snakes around rifles and packs. At night, phosphorescent fungi glowed faintly, casting the impression of figures standing in the darkness. Fireflies swarmed in strange patterns, circling patrols as if herding them into traps. And always there was the sound, the low, endless hum of insects that sometimes seemed to form words, chants, or whispers that no one could quite understand. One story, told in hushed tones even decades later, described an entire platoon that entered a valley near the Cambodian border and emerged days later unable to explain what had happened inside. Their watches had stopped. Their compasses spun wildly. Some claimed they had walked in circles, passing the same tree again and again though they swore they never turned. Others spoke of losing hours, even days, unable to account for stretches of time that had vanished. One soldier, delirious with fever, claimed he saw lines of soldiers marching through the valley, French, Japanese, even ancient warriors with spears and armor, each ghostly column passing in silence, each vanishing as quickly as it appeared. Perhaps the most chilling accounts were of mass hauntings, when entire units experienced the same impossible event. In one case, near Khe Sanh, a squad bivouacked for the night reported being awoken by the sound of dozens of men marching past their camp. They rose, weapons ready, expecting an ambush. But when they scanned the darkness, what they saw froze them in place. A column of shadowy figures, hundreds strong, moving silently through the trees. The soldiers raised their rifles, but their commanding officer ordered them to hold fire. For nearly 10 minutes the phantoms passed, their faces pale, their uniforms torn, some clutching wounds that bled into nothing. When the last figure vanished into the night, the jungle returned to silence. In the morning they found no tracks, no broken branches, no sign that anything had moved through at all. Veterans who experienced these mass events insisted they were not dreams, not shared hallucinations, but something real, something that left a mark on all of them. Some swore their rifles jammed afterward, their compasses failed, their radios refused to work. Others said the air remained cold for hours, a chill that lingered even in the sweltering Vietnamese heat. And all of them, to their dying days, swore that what they saw was not the enemy, not a trick of the mind, but the restless dead, forever walking the paths where they had fallen. The deeper the war went, the more men whispered that Vietnam itself was alive. Not just the people, not just the enemy, but the land, the rivers, the trees. It was a place that devoured men whole and refused to release them, a place where time fractured and the dead marched forever. They began to believe that the war had awakened something ancient in the soil, something that had been waiting for centuries. And when the veterans came home, when they tried to leave the jungle behind, they carried that belief with them like a sickness. Some would wake in the middle of the night to the smell of wet earth and gunpowder, even in the middle of a city apartment. Others found themselves drawn to forests and swamps, standing silently among the trees as though listening for voices only they could hear. Families noticed it too, the way their fathers, husbands, brothers would stare into the woods behind their homes, their expressions blank as if waiting for the jungle to call them back. The war was over, but the land still owned them. And in the dark hours of the night, when they heard footsteps in the hall or whispers in the wind, they knew the truth: Vietnam had never let them go. By the time the war ended, the battle was far from over. For many veterans, returning home felt less like an escape and more like stepping into another kind of jungle. One without gunfire or ambushes, but filled with shadows that never left their side. The war had claimed their comrades, but what followed threatened to claim their sanity. Doctors called it post-traumatic stress. Families called it nerves. But the men themselves used another word. They said they were haunted. Night after night, they woke screaming, their hands clawing at sheets, their lungs filled with the stench of smoke and blood that wasn't really there. Some swore they saw figures in their bedrooms, standing at the edges of the dark, watching silently. One soldier, Peter Hall, woke every night at 2:30 a.m. to the sound of boots stomping through his hallway. When he turned on the light, the footsteps stopped, but the smell of wet jungle earth lingered for hours. His children refused to sleep in the house, claiming a faceless man stood at their doors whispering in a language they could not understand. For others, the hauntings were not just at night. In the quiet of their days, men reported flashes of the jungle, vivid and sudden, as though the world around them had been replaced. A veteran driving home from work described how the road ahead blurred into a dirt trail, lined with bamboo and thick mist. He slammed his brakes, terrified, only for the vision to vanish, leaving him shaking in the middle of the highway. Suicides became a shadow epidemic among those who carried the ghosts too long. Families discovered notes scrawled in trembling hands, not confessions but warnings. "I can't fight them anymore. They've come for me. Tell them I'm sorry I left them behind." Some men were found with their old dog tags clutched in their fists, as though the war had claimed them twice. At wakes, widows whispered of strange happenings, photographs falling from shelves, radios turning on by themselves, candles guttering out at the mention of Vietnam. It was as if the dead had come to collect their own. Desperate, some veterans turned to the church. Priests were summoned to bless houses, sprinkle holy water on beds, banish whatever walked in the halls at night. Father James Delaney, who ministered to veterans in the late 70s, recorded dozens of such requests. He wrote of one exorcism in Ohio, where a veteran claimed the faces of his fallen squad appeared in mirrors and windows. Delaney entered the house with his crucifix and prayer book, only to hear muffled cries coming from the basement. When he descended, he found the walls damp with condensation, the air thick with the smell of smoke. He swore he heard boots marching in the darkness, circling him as he prayed. The veteran collapsed in tears as the lights flickered and the cries grew louder, then suddenly cut off. Delaney later wrote, "I do not know if the demons of Vietnam can be cast out. They do not leave. They wait." Psychologists tried to offer rational explanations. They spoke of trauma, memory loops, the mind replaying what it could not process. But even they were unsettled by certain cases. Patients reported knowing things they should not, recounting the names of enemy soldiers buried in villages they had never visited, describing battles in detail they had not fought. One therapist recalled a session where her patient began speaking fluent Vietnamese mid-hypnosis, though he had never learned more than a handful of words in the war. His voice shifted, his cadence strange, as though another man was speaking through him. She ended the session abruptly, shaken to her core. Perhaps the most disturbing were the veterans who claimed the ghosts were no longer just around them, but inside them. They spoke of losing time, of waking in places they did not remember going, of hearing voices in their heads commanding them to return, to finish what was left undone. One man, William Stark, confessed to his wife that he sometimes saw his reflection smile when he did not, its lips moving to form words he could not hear. He refused to look in mirrors after that, covering everyone in the house with blankets. Some families believed the hauntings were contagious. Wives who had never set foot in Vietnam dreamed of firefights in jungles they could describe in exact detail. Children reported nightmares of soldiers calling their names, of cold hands brushing their skin at night. In one case, a boy told his mother he had been visited by the man with the hole in his chest. When she asked how he knew, he pointed to his father's old photo album. "That's him," the boy whispered, placing his finger on the image of his father's dead squad mate, a man he had never met, a man who had died decades before he was born. Hospitals began to notice strange trends too. Veterans brought in for unrelated ailments often died suddenly at night, their monitors flatlining without warning. Nurses swore they heard whispers in the rooms just before it happened, voices calling the men by name. In one ward, 5 veterans died in the same week, all between 3 o'clock and 4 a.m. The staff began to refuse night shifts, terrified of the unseen visitors that seemed to pass through the halls. As the years passed, it became harder to separate memory from haunting, trauma from possession. Veterans described themselves as hollow, carrying more of the dead inside them than the living around them. They did not fear dying, they feared what waited for them when they crossed over. Some believed they would return to the jungle, condemned to march forever alongside the comrades they had lost, their souls tied eternally to the cursed ground of Vietnam. And in their quiet moments, in hospital beds and lonely apartments, some swore they could already hear it, the faint, distant sound of boots on wet earth, the cries of men in the fog, the war calling them home. As the decades passed, the survivors of Vietnam began to fade away, their bodies worn down not only by time but by the weight of everything they had carried home. Yet even in their final years, the shadows of the war did not leave them. In nursing homes and VA hospitals, the stories repeated, echoing like broken records. Footsteps in the night, whispers in the halls, the presence of comrades long dead. The older they grew, the stronger the hauntings seemed to become, as though the dead were drawing closer, waiting for them to finally cross over. Nurses told of men who awoke in their last hours speaking to invisible figures, their trembling hands reaching out to people no one else could see. One veteran in California rose from his bed days before death, saluted and whispered, "Sir, the men are ready." He died minutes later, his hand still raised. Another in Pennsylvania clutched his nurse's arm and gasped, "They've come for me, all of them." His body went limp seconds after, his face twisted not in fear but in relief. The hauntings spread beyond the veterans themselves. Their children, grown now with families of their own, carried fragments of the war they had never fought. Some dreamed of firefights, others of faceless soldiers staring through their windows at night. Daughters described phantom hands brushing their hair, sons reported voices calling their names in the darkness. Entire families began to believe they had inherited the curse, as if the ghosts of Vietnam were not bound to the men alone, but to their bloodlines. In one chilling case, a grandson in Oregon began speaking Vietnamese words in his sleep. He had never studied the language, had never even heard it at home. His mother, horrified, recorded the words and played them for a translator. The boy had whispered, "We are not finished. We march forever." When she showed the recording to her father, a veteran of Khe Sanh, he broke down in tears. Those were the last words spoken by a dying comrade in his arms, words he had never told anyone else. Photographs from funerals deepened the fear. Families reported strange streaks of light hovering near coffins, blurred faces appearing beside mourners. In one image taken at a veteran's burial in Texas, a pale figure stood among the mourners, its features indistinct, its outline glowing faintly in the sun. No one remembered anyone standing there. The negative confirmed it had been captured on film. The family never spoke of it again. As the generation of Vietnam veterans dwindled, those who remained whispered of a final truth they had come to believe, that the war was not finished, that it could not be finished. The jungle still held their dead. The villages still echoed with their cries. And the land itself, soaked in blood, scarred by fire, had never released the men who had walked it. They spoke of Vietnam not as a country but as a living, breathing thing, a presence that clung to them, followed them, claimed them piece by piece. And when the veterans finally passed, many families swore the hauntings did not stop. Widows described hearing boots in the hallway. Children saw their father's shadows lingering in doorways. One woman said her husband's chair rocked for weeks after his death, moving slowly as though someone still sat there, staring silently at the window. The war had ended on paper, but in the lives of those who had fought it, in the homes they returned to, in the dreams that plagued their families, it had never ended at all. The ghosts marched on, relentless, eternal. And so, late at night, when the world grows quiet, when the air feels heavy and the silence becomes unbearable, some still swear they can hear it. The sound of boots on wet ground, the cries of men in the fog, the whispers of voices carried on the wind. The ghosts of Vietnam, forever walking, forever waiting, reminding the living that the war never truly let them go. Because in the end, the ghosts do not haunt the jungle. The ghosts haunt the men who survived it.